For reference, this happened when I was 8 years old, and I'm a female. My mom, dad, 10-year-old sister, and I were moving from an apartment to a larger house in a town in North Georgia. Everyone was excited about the upgrade, and we were all looking forward to the move, but I had this nagging sense of dread. I did not associate the feeling of dread with the move itself. I didn't know why I felt this way, and I was having pretty bad nightmares at the time too. Every night for a week straight, I had these horrible nightmares of my mom being attacked. Each night, the circumstances of her attack was different, but usually it involved either a single man or a group of men attacking her. In my nightmares, it was always her, and my mom could have probably escaped, but since I was there, she couldn't just run away because she wanted to protect me. In one of my nightmares, I hid behind our car while 10 men menacingly approached her, each one with some ridiculous medieval-style weapon. I heard her sickening screams as I jolted awake. It went on like that for a week. I thought the dreams were weird, and I told everyone in my family about them, but nobody took it seriously. I don't think many people would, especially coming from a kid who was a little different, and as imaginative as I was. After I told people about the dreams, I mostly put them out of my mind. The day of the move came, and we needed to borrow a truck from my grandparents, who lived on an old 2-lane highway. It's one of those old back roads that was built before the larger highways. This old narrow highway was busy, and cars would typically drive way too fast, but was also quite rural. My mom, sister, and I made several trips all day, back and forth, between the old apartment and our new house, loading and unloading most of our things while my dad was at work. We decided to at least try to have the most fun we possibly could, so we were laughing and making jokes at everything. Because of this, I was in a pretty good mood that day. After several hours of moving, it was starting to get dark and we needed to return the truck to my grandparents. As we pulled into the yard, my mom parked it in its usual spot, all the way across the yard, away from the house, next to a group of large bushes. My mom got out first and was midway through the yard walking toward the house, when I noticed she wasn't moving anymore. She had suddenly frozen in her tracks. I kept going, skipping along and happy as could be, when I noticed a tall, skinny, rough-looking man. He was walking from a parked car pulled over by the side of the road, half hidden in another bunch of bushes. He asked my mom if he could come inside and use the phone. My mom said she had a bad feeling about the guy. He looked out of place, and she knew it wasn't a good situation. I had no clue that it was someone I should fear, and yelled, "Yeah, come on in." I was very naive at the time. My older sister also knew this was bad, and hid behind the truck. My mom was in a bad spot. She couldn't run towards me and hope to make it to the door in time, because then she would be leaving my sister alone with this guy. She couldn't run to my sister, because that would leave me alone with him. She just stood still, not saying a word, and I was starting to grasp the seriousness of what was happening, just as the guy charged her. I took off screaming, running to the door, and beating on it as hard as I could for my grandparents to help us. I turned around to see what was going on with my mom and the stranger, just in time to see my mom throwing him over her fucking shoulder. He hit the ground hard and looked a little confused. I guess he decided to cut his losses, because after he regained some of his senses, he grabbed my mom's pocketbook, which was on the ground now, and took off toward the car and drove off. By this time, my grandma had finally made it to the door and let us all in. We called the police right away. My mom and sister then told me that they saw more than one guy in the car that was pulled over on the side of the road. Their car was distinctive. It was old, from the 70s or 80s, and had a dark purple paint job. We realized that the men kept driving up and down the road and circling around. Maybe they planned to attack us again. I was scared shitless, shaking uncontrollably and crying. My mom had these dark red scratches on her back from the fight. He probably scratched her as he was being thrown down. My dad and two of my uncles made it to my grandparents' house before the police did, and we were ready to defend ourselves. Even my grandmother pulled out an old rifle she apparently kept in her closet for just this sort of emergency. About a week after the attack, we found my mom's pocketbook in the middle of the yard. All of her credit cards and money taken out, of course, but everything else was intact. We figured the men decided to return it to her and threw it out the window as they drove by one day. My grandmother had to be extra vigilant living on that highway. This wasn't the only scary situation we had while she lived there. One day, while my grandma was alone, she just happened to be looking out her front window at the time to see a car silently gliding from the road to the driveway. It was as if they turned their engine off and coasted to the front porch. She decided that she didn't want to deal with whatever was happening. She was weary of strangers coming up to the house after the attack on my mom, and these people were acting strange. My grandma hid and heard someone knocking on the door. She peeked outside to see a seemingly non-threatening woman and her son on the porch asking to use the phone. The woman said she needed to come in and use the phone because she had car trouble. My grandma thought about letting them in, but decided against it, and said she couldn't do anything. My grandma told her through the door that she was sorry, but she couldn't let anyone that she didn't know inside, but offered to make a phone call for her. The woman on the porch got angry at this. "I need to come in and make a phone call now. It's just me and my son." My grandma didn't want to chance anything. After seeing them pull up into the yard in such an odd way, engines off, and now the woman was acting aggressive, she decided to call the police. My grandma felt bad about the kid being out there, but she knew she couldn't risk it, and I'm so glad that she didn't. After a while of begging and yelling to use the phone, the woman gave up, went back to the car and started the engine up. My grandma was surprised to hear it crank right up just fine. About that time, the police arrived. The police officer seemed irritated with these people and told them they had to leave, and they did. He then came to the door and told my grandma that 2 men were ducked down in the back seat of the car, and one of them was holding a solid lug wrench. If they were just innocent people who needed help, why were they hiding? About 6 months ago, I was staying at a friend's flat. We stayed up until about midnight, just watching videos on YouTube, listening to a bit of music, and just generally hanging out. At about 11 or 12, we opened the back door, have a cigarette, and finally call it a night. At about 11 or 12, we open the back door, have a cigarette, and finally call it a night. As she goes into her nightly routine of putting on her pajamas, brushing her teeth, etc., I decided to put on a film, get comfy on her sofa, grab some food, and get ready for bed myself. We eventually say goodnight, and I settle down for the night. A little backstory. Her flat is an odd layout. It's a ground floor flat with an L-shaped garden. Her back door is on the side of the flat, which opens up into the living room, where I sleep. From there you can see the kitchen, which is only separated from the living room by a half-wall partition. In these 2 rooms, there are a lot of windows, and the door is also glass, so for privacy reasons, she always has her blinds down, except for the kitchen window. I had just settled down and began to go through my usual social media sites when I get that stereotypical gut feeling and the voice in my head telling me to lock the door. I bolt up, lock the door, and sit back down. I have always been the type of person that will listen to my gut instinct, no matter how ridiculous it makes me look or feel. I just sat back down when I hear a very faint but close cat meow. Something in my gut told me not to open that door. From the position of the sofa, I can see underneath her blinds covering the door whilst remaining hidden myself. I decide to look, and what I saw terrifies me to this day. A large shadowy figure of a man laying on the floor looking through the blinds straight back at me. I had never been so scared in my entire life. I ran into the hall, about to run into my friend's room to tell her what I had seen, when all of a sudden, there was a knock so loud on the front door that it could have woken up the dead. I completely froze in my tracks, unable to move. I was so scared I could feel my heartbeat in my mouth, My friend comes rushing out of her room. We look each other straight in the eyes, and before we can even speak, another deafening blow on the door shakes the flat. We both stand there in fear of what is to come when we hear, "It's the police! Open the door!" We stand there in tears as the door is continually pounded, each blow bigger than the last. It felt like we were there for an eternity, but it couldn't have been any longer than 20 seconds. I finally muster up the courage to look through the peephole, and to my surprise, it was the police. I flung the door open, and they said that they had to make a welfare check on my friend. The police spoke to my friend, made sure she was okay, and she went back to bed. I then told the police what happened. They took my statement and said that a patrol would be on guard for the night. After knowing that the police knew about the event and were patrolling the area, I felt a lot better and decided to try and get back to my film and then go to sleep. At about 3 a.m., I awake to the feeling that someone was watching me. I slowly turned my head towards the kitchen, and to my absolute horror, the figure was back, staring at me through the window holding a decapitated cat head. I screamed and ran into my friend's room once again, and we called the police. The police arrived only moments later. They took my statement, and as I'm explaining the situation, my friend completely drains of color and throws up. She looks visibly terrified and on the verge of tears. The police ask her what is wrong, and she says that the person I have described is her ex-boyfriend, a drug-abusing homeless mental asylum escapee. He was diagnosed as a paranoid schizophrenic with a heroin and meth addiction, and there was obviously already a warrant out for his arrest. Had I really come that close to being a victim of a mental drug addict? Who knows what this psycho was capable of? I mean, fuck! The dude had a decapitated fucking cat. Obviously, I was extremely shaken, and I still have nightmares about the whole thing. However, I can now sleep easier as my friend informed me that her psycho ex had died of a heroin overdose and can no longer terrorize anyone else. My name is Anna. I'm a 16-year-old girl who lives in Flanders. My story happened when Christmas was near, 22nd of December 2014 to be exact. I went with my mom and sister to my aunt's house in Havasu, the southern part of Belgium, to celebrate Christmas Eve. Havasu is a very pretty village in a wooded area. We arrived and everything was great. We had a lot of fun preparing for Christmas Eve. That night my cousin and I were upstairs in his room picking movies to watch and catching up. He talked about this abandoned castle he visited with some friends, Chateau Miranda. I had heard of it, but never saw it in real life. The castle served first as a home for a wealthy family, but at the beginning of World War II, it was turned into an orphanage. It has been empty since 1991. I'm a horror freak, so the thought of visiting a scary abandoned castle sounded amazing to me. But there were two problems. One, you're not allowed to enter the property, since its condition's so bad it's deemed unsafe, and it's on private property. And two, my mom and aunt would never let us go, since they planned the whole visit with activities. I convinced my cousin that we should go check it out the following night. So as planned, he told my aunt and mom that we would hang out in Victor's house, one of his friends. They had no problem with it, as long as we came home on time. When we got to his car, I felt sort of guilty for lying to them. After a short drive, we arrived at the castle. It must have been around 10 p.m. It was pitch black outside, and you could only see the tower of the castle due to the moon. When I got out of the car, I had chills down my spine. I have no idea if it was because of the cold or the very unsettling surroundings. We knew that there was a gate with cameras in front of the castle, so we had to go around, through the woods, to get inside. Now, you would think we saw something horrific in the forest, but that wasn't the case. On the contrary, it was quiet. Almost too quiet. No sound of the wind, no owls, only our footsteps. My cousin would sometimes ask if I'm still okay, but for the rest of the time we didn't speak until we were inside. When we entered the building through what was supposed to be a door, I was stunned by the beauty inside. Of course, everything was broken. Most of the windows and doors were damaged or gone, and the walls were full of graffiti from previous visitors and urban explorers. With the lights of our phones, we looked around and went as high as we could. We are looking around on the first floor, when suddenly my cousin says, "Anna, there are people sitting outside." I thought he was trying to scare me, and said I didn't believe him. He was still staring through the window, and said in an almost whispering voice, "I'm dead serious. Please, come have a look." My cousin is always joking around, and loves scaring people, so I was still a bit stubborn to let him have the pleasure in tricking me. He looked angry and terrified at the same time, and with a shaking voice he said I had to come look. I felt confused, but not scared, still thinking it was a dumb joke. I walked to him by the window and looked outside. I saw 3 figures on the ground. Not sure if it was people, maybe it was shadows from surrounding objects, and it was really hard to see. Then, my cousin did something that I still get angry for when I think about it. He took out his phone again, and put on the flashlight and pointed it at the 3 figures. I immediately tried to hide the light so whatever the hell was down there couldn't see that we were up here. We peeked through the window to see what we could. I swear, what I saw at that moment was the scariest thing I had ever seen. The 3 figures stood up, and I'm sure they were people at this point. They all started running to the door of the castle and made their way inside the building. My cousin looked at me and tried to say something, but he stuttered so much out of fear, I didn't understand a thing he was saying. I grabbed his hand and we tried, as quietly as possible, to hide in one of the rooms. I had no idea what was going on. I wanted to run and get out of that place, but I was scared I'd trip over all the mess or bump into people. We just sat there. I even started to cry a little. After a few minutes, which felt like hours, we heard someone whistling a song in the distance. I didn't recognize what song it was, but you can imagine how creepy it was to hear something like that when you're hiding in the dark out of fear. I felt sick, and I started to think about what we would do if we saw them. Or worse, what they would do to us. Time passed by, and we didn't see them. Just the scary silence again. My cousin whispered that we had to try to get out now. We stood up and walked slowly to the door we entered through. Suddenly, while we were walking to the door, we heard men screaming and crying. We heard it so close, but we didn't see anything. My cousin and I didn't hesitate anymore, and crawled out of one of the half-broken windows and ran for our lives back into the woods. We didn't speak or look back, we just kept running back to the car. That was the only thing that mattered. Everything went very quickly after that. We got home, the family was already in bed, and we went upstairs. We were talking about other stuff, just to forget the experience, when all of a sudden he said in a panic, "I can't find my fucking phone. I must have dropped it while we were running." No way I was going back. I told him to let it go and get another one. Christmas came, and we didn't mention or even talk about the castle. A few days later, I went back home and I tried not to think about anything that happened. But, after a few weeks, when I got home from school, I got a message from my cousin. It was a picture of his phone. It was cracked and bloody. Apparently, he went during the daytime with his friends to the castle to search for his phone. They found it in one of the rooms. He said the phone still worked, but had 2 photos of blood on the ground, and 14 missed calls. The thing is, none of them recognized the number, and when they tried to call it, it said the number didn't exist. I was creeped out and felt sick again. So many questions run through my mind. What happened in that castle? Why was there blood on the floor? Who called the phone? Who were those people? And where the hell are they now? Myself, my cousin, and his friends decided not to talk about it again ever, and pretend it never happened. But to this day, I often get nightmares about it, and I still hear those screams. What I'm about to share took place only a few days ago, in April 2016. I'm a 17-year-old female living in a small town in a mountainous area in southeastern Europe. I've always been the outdoorsy type of person. I love hiking, camping, mountain climbing, or simply just enjoying the quietude of nature. I'm pretty much a loner, and I spend most of my time outside by myself. I don't actually go all alone. I take my 3-year-old, medium-sized hound with me during my hikes. Sometimes, he chases deer, foxes, and rabbits, running, sniffing, and barking like crazy, without ever actually catching them, as he has not been trained for this. The point is, he is familiar with the smell of these animals, and he always gets super excited when sensing it. This will come in handy soon. It was a usual day, coming home from school and then heading into the woods around town with my dog. Fast forward 3 hours as we are making our way home, climbing down the hills, as a rainstorm was approaching and the wind was getting pretty chilly. It was about 6 p.m. when we get to our base camp. It was a nice wooden bench situated at a crossroads. Instead of continuing home, I decided to take a shorter detour. I wanted to check out some flowers growing near a small stream. As I was walking down the trail, I noticed a beech tree right next to the trail which had some dark liquid matter all over it. My dog was walking ahead of me, but he didn't seem interested in what was on the tree. As I got closer, I realized, in horror, that it was blood. Lots of fresh blood, splattered all over the tree, and it had dripped onto the dead leaves in the ground. I looked around, searched for the remains of an animal, but found nothing. I got my phone out and took a few pictures as I picked up the stained leaf from the ground to smell it. It was definitely blood. My first thought was that maybe someone had skinned an animal, but my dog was quiet and seemed uninterested in all the blood. Had it been from an animal, the smell of it would have driven him nuts, as usual. This made me think that it was unlikely for it to have been from an animal. While facing the tree, behind me was a deep valley filled with mud and dead leaves. I obviously didn't climb down. I just peeked in its direction from the trail, but couldn't see anything as it was getting dark. Finally, my dog and I left and sprinted home, where I showed my dad the pictures I had taken. He decided to show them to the police, thinking that even if it was just an animal, it was probably the victim of poachers. Luckily, the rain never came, so the blood was not washed away. However, what the police found still gives me chills. Buried in all the mud and leaves, there was a body of a man at the bottom of that valley. His head was smashed in, and they haven't been able to identify him yet, so the police are still investigating what happened. Now, my father is really freaked out about this, and he's definitely against me ever going into the woods alone again. What truly scares me about this is that I could have stumbled across this horrifying scene right when it was taking place. Who knows what would have happened then? If you enjoyed this video, you know what to do. If you would like a chance to have your story featured in an upcoming video, make sure you check the description for information on how to submit your stories. I really appreciate you all watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day. And just remember, it's always scarier if it's true. The police they smoked my friend. Chaute Miranda, however. He looked angry and terrified at the same time, and with a shaking voice he said I had to come look. Fuck. Motherfuckers. But